And so we have to wall off our agriculture, keep it from the wolves at the door of all the different kinds. And we can do whatever we want in there. And in order to feed the population, we need to use every technology, pesticides, herbicides. Well, herbicides are kind of pesticide. Fertilizers, machines. We need to use the latest genetic engineering and so forth so that we can increase the yields there, because otherwise there's going to be no room for nature and it's going to disappear. So it's seen as a way of protecting us from nature by the farmers who are at war against the weeds and the pests, but then also as a way of protecting nature against us by the environmentalists and the conservationists. In either case, you've got this big separation. And so I think it's deep in the psyche of our culture that you need to keep our culture, that you need to keep nature and culture separate for the betterment of both. Unfortunately, this is not possible. Water runs off. You end up with a dead zone at the Gulf of Mexico where all the agricultural runoff has ended up and is killing off all the sea life. Pollutants from the air pollution from the agricultural chemicals evaporates and ends up in the Arctic, contaminating polar bears. Birds fly in and take seeds out, and so forth and so on. It's impossible to keep these two things separate. We've taken it a step further also. The insanity, it's a form of, in my opinion, a form of insanity when we're at war against dandelions. These are beautiful yellow flowers, exuberant, medicinal. The leaves, the roots have all kinds of important medicinal qualities that have been recognized for centuries. Delicious, edible, all the parts. A highly useful and vigorous plant. And people, your neighbors, are willing to poison and give cancer to their own children and dogs using pesticides to kill dandelions. This is insane. And this has to be learned. Children do not automatically hate dandelions with the kind of passion that many homeowners do. So we put genetic engineering into the context of a bunch of dandelion haters. And it's dangerous. So Roundup Ready soybeans, back to Roundup Ready soybeans. What is the intent? Besides being able to couple an agricultural chemical with a seed variety so that you maintain a higher profit. You know, that's always the bottom line with the genetic engineering products that are produced by industry, because of course that's their reason for existing. But what's the reason for people adopting the technology? Being able to realize that dream of a cleaner field more easily. Now, Roundup is a broad-spectrum herbicide, meaning that it kills broadleaf weeds and grass weeds. And in the past, before soybeans were engineered to be able to withstand Roundup without themselves dying, Roundup had limited applications in agriculture because of it killing your crop if you used it too close to the time that you were planting your crop. So it was used in burn down applications where you would clear the field of weeds completely before you planted your crop. But then after the crop was growing, you couldn't use it on the whole field, although you could use it in some spot applications, because then it would, of course, kill the soybeans. This is true of many of the herbicides that are used. They can only be used at certain times. The weeds have to be at a certain stage of development and so forth. So in spite of the desire for a clean field, it's been difficult to achieve that dream, that goal. And so there were weeds. And the weeds were very important for my vision of agriculture, which is where nature and agriculture are intertwined and coexist. And so the weeds were providing places where butterfly larvae could eat and develop before flying off. They were providing the structure around the edges of fields and in fields for spiders to live so that they could provide some biological control. They were providing seeds for birds. They were bringing up nutrients from deeper in the soil than the crop roots went, and so forth and so on. In many parts of the world, the weeds were also important food. So in many parts of Asia, South America, Africa, primarily women who hand weeded took the weeds home and fed them to their livestock or fed them to their families. Many of the weeds like amaranth, pigweed, goosefoot have many higher, they're much denser in nutrients than the crops are. Higher in vitamins, higher in protein. So the weeds provided an important food source as they were removed from the fields. Another use for weeds was as trap plants, where insects would prefer to lay their eggs or to eat those weeds, and then someone would come through and remove the weeds. So they would have lots of different purposes. And in sustainable ag systems, these purposes were intentional. In industrial monocultures, it was just too difficult to get rid of them all, although that was the goal. So now, technology used as intended. If the Roundup Ready soybeans are working as intended and protecting the soybeans against the herbicide, then it means that they can finally achieve the clean field. And when I drive through the countryside of southern Indiana down by the White River in those valleys where they're growing corn and soybeans industrially, I'm shocked at how clean those fields are compared to 10, 15 years ago. And not just the fields, the hedgerows, the fences, right up to the road. The ease with which you can keep nature and agriculture separate is pretty impressive. Now, what's the effect of that on the environment and on our health? The kind of a surprising result has come from a series of studies in the United Kingdom that were published this last fall. These were called the farm scale evaluation studies, and if you look at the British Soil Association website or some of the organic farming websites, you'll see lots of critiques of these studies, and they aren't very definitive. Short-term, 2-3 year studies for ecological studies without a baseline to start with and so forth. I could critique these studies in detail, saying that they don't really answer the question of what the wide use of genetically engineered crops would do to the environment in Britain. But nonetheless, they are some of the few studies that have been done looking at all of the different organisms that they were able to identify from the soil to the birds and how frequent these organisms were in genetically engineered canola, corn, and sugar beet versus non-genetically engineered but still industrially farmed varieties of the same crops. So they laid out plots, and they did a comparison where they tried to measure the biodiversity. And with the canola and the sugar beet, they found that when they used herbicide-resistant varieties of the canola and the sugar beet versus their normal cultivation practices, there were fewer organisms in the fields in general at the different levels of organization. So that would indicate that there was a less diverse group of organisms when you use the herbicides, indicating that they're probably working fairly well because in the short term, because the conclusion was that for wildlife to exist in these fields, they need weeds. That these weeds are very important to having nature and agriculture coexist. Now, in England, this is a big deal because they don't have the big wilderness areas and the big national forests and things that we have. They think of their countryside as nature. And so they were concerned, and they are hoping that the agriculturalists develop practices that allow the various skylarks and other birds and animals to be there. Now with the corn, it was a different story. They used Roundup Ready corn, and they found that there were a few more organisms, more biodiversity in the Roundup Ready corn than in their conventionally grown controls. However, in the corn, they were using atrazine, which is an herbicide that has been used widely in corn here in the United States. Atrazine is being phased out in the European Union by the year 2005 because of recent studies showing that it's an endocrine disruptor, meaning that at low levels, it can cause hormonal changes that dramatically disrupt the development of various animals. Amphibians have been used as the main study organism, frogs. Frogs that have the wrong number of legs or are missing organs, that sort of thing, when exposed to low levels of atrazine. Now, these studies were done in the United States at Berkeley, but the banning of atrazine took place in Europe. So the reason that the Roundup Ready had a little bit more biodiversity relative to the atrazine, and they were using it with another herbicide regime, was that the atrazine was a more acutely toxic herbicide. So not only did you have, and also it was effective. So you had very few weeds, and it was more toxic to more organisms. Now, so you aren't really comparing in this farm scale evaluation. You aren't comparing genetically engineered industrial grown crops with, say, organic agriculture or some other kind of sustainable farming practice that uses low inputs. You're comparing it to the most common, fairly toxic practices. Does that make sense? So, you know, when used as intended, the big environmental effect is it's too effective, it's too efficient. The fields are too clean, and it's important not to have a big wall between nature and agriculture. Another aspect of this is the idea of thinking of the war between agriculture and nature, that if we don't keep weeds out, we aren't going to have enough food. We have to have higher and higher and higher yields, and those weeds are competing with the corn and the soybeans. And we don't want any birds or anything. We don't want anything coming in there. This is the way our whole economic system works as well. We work on a scarcity model. The idea of scarce resources and competing for those scarce resources. Many sustainable agriculture practices work on a different economic model. They work on a model of abundance, the idea that there's enough for everyone, that we can share, that the birds have a right to part of our crop, that the weeds have a place in our field, that we welcome an interaction between nature and agriculture, and that there's enough.